The night Maggie Cole was dragged through the dust behind the Copper Star, the whole town slept as if danger were a distant rumor, not a woman's breath slipping away in the dark. And maybe she would have disappeared into that silence forever, if not for the sound of bat-wing doors exploding open and a stranger stepping through the light with the kind of stillness a man earns only after surviving too much hurt. But here's the part nobody in Coyote Bend could have predicted, that the moment a bruised woman thought all hope was gone was the same moment a wounded cowboy decided he'd stop running from the world and start fighting for someone in it. Yet what began as a rescue would ignite something far more dangerous. For Maggie, for the town, and for the man who refused to ride away. And this is where their story truly begins. The morning light in Coyote Bend came slow and thin, sliding between the boards of shuttered windows like it was cautious about waking the town. Dust drifted low across Main Street, stirred by nothing more than a weak breeze rolling off the sandstone ridge to the east. The blacksmith had already begun pounding at a stubborn shoe, and each ring of his hammer drifted out over the quiet like a heartbeat. A church bell chimed once, its lonely note flattening in the cool air. Maggie Cole stepped out from her cabin, arms full of neatly folded linens, wrapped in a canvas sling. 34 years old and long widowed, she carried herself the way a woman does when she's learned to work through everything: heat, sorrow, and the plain fact that nobody's coming to help. Her back was straight, her eyes calm, but there were creases at the corners that spoke of years spent squinting into wind-blown dust and trying not to feel the weight of being alone. She walked toward the boarding house across town, her boots tapping lightly over the packed clay. As she passed the Copper Star Saloon, she kept her gaze firmly forward. Respectable women didn't look at saloons, not even at their shadow. The swinging doors creaked softly in the breeze, as if greeting her or warning her. She couldn't say. She tightened her grip on the linens and kept walking. That was when Wade Kincaid stepped into her path. He smelled of last night's whiskey and the kind of arrogance only a judge's son could afford. Wade was broad-shouldered, handsome in the careless way of men who never expect consequences. Two of his drinking friends flanked him laughing, nudging each other like boys about to kick over a lantern just to see the flames dance. "Mornin', Miss Cole," Wade drawled, his boots spreading wide in front of her. "You're looking awful fine for this early." "I'm on an errand," Maggie said, keeping her voice steady. "Please move." His hand reached out as if to brush a bit of dust from her sleeve, but the touch lingered too long. Then it closed around her forearm, firm and proprietary. Now, he murmured. "Don't be shy. A lady like you deserves a little company." His friends chuckled. Maggie tried to step back, but his grip tightened, fingers digging through the cotton of her dress. "Let go," she whispered. Wade leaned in, breath warm with whiskey. "We're just having some fun." Then the grip became a pull. The pull became a jerk. Maggie stumbled forward as Wade dragged her toward the narrow alley beside the saloon. The linens slipped from her arm, scattering across the ground behind her like fallen doves. She twisted, tried to wrench free, but he was stronger and determined. The alley was dim, smelling of sour beer and horse sweat. Wade shoved open the back door, pushing Maggie inside. The air was thick with smoke from a hearth not yet cleaned, the floor sticky with last night's spilled liquor. Two early drinkers looked up from their mugs, then quickly away. The barkeep busied himself, wiping glasses that were already clean. "Upstairs," Wade said, shifting his grip to her waist as she struggled, No, Maggie gasped, clawing at the doorway. Please, please stop. Her voice wavered, but she didn't scream. Screaming felt like something a woman might do if she believed someone would come. Wade shoved harder, steering her toward the staircase that led to the back rooms, the ones with the curtained windows, and the whispers behind the walls. Her breath came fast, heart pounding against her ribs. For a moment, everything slowed the heavy smell of stale tobacco, the soft thud of her boots against the plank floor, the resigned silence of the men who would not look at her. This is it, she thought. No one's coming. Just then, the front doors slammed open so hard the bat wings smacked against the walls. Light poured in, hot, bright, blinding. A man stepped out of that light as if he'd been carved from it. Dust coated his long coat and hat brim, traveling down to boots that had walked farther than most men dared. His shoulders were straight, too straight for an ordinary cowboy. Something about the way he held himself quiet, controlled, ready, marked him as someone who'd seen gunfire up close and didn't flinch from it. Luke Carver, 42. A name nobody in Coyote Bend knew yet. He paused just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust. Then he saw her Maggie, bruised grip, marks on her arms, struggling against Wade Kincaid. His jaw tightened, but the rest of him stayed still. Let the lady go, he said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the weight of a man who'd spent years giving orders when bullets were flying. Wade turned, half laughing. Who the hell are you? Luke didn't answer. He just stared, quiet as winter stone. Wade lifted his revolver with a smirk, the barrel wobbling slightly from drink. Maggie felt the cold spike of terror shoot down her spine, but Luke moved first. There was no warning, just a flash of metal, a crack louder than the hammer at the blacksmith's forge, and a shower of splintered glass from a whiskey bottle behind Wade's shoulder. Wade cried out. The revolver clattered to the floor, his arm streaked with blood from a clean graze. Silence swallowed the room. The drinkers froze, mugs half raised. The barkeep ducked behind the counter. Even the dust motes seemed to hang motionless in the beams of light. Maggie stood trembling behind Luke, breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. Her hair had fallen from its pins, a loose strand sticking to her cheek, where Wade's rough grip had scraped her skin. Wade stared at his bleeding arm, then at the stranger who'd drawn on him, without hesitation. You're dead, he stammered. Luke holstered his gun with a motion so smooth it barely seemed real. No, he said softly, but you might be if you touch her again. The words didn't need more volume. They carried a promise. Wade scrambled back on the floor, howling for his friends to help him, but they had gone pale and still. Nobody moved. Maggie lifted her eyes to Luke's back, still broad and unmoving in front of her. He didn't look at her yet. He didn't reach for her arm or ask if she was all right. He just stood there, the line drawn, the whole town able to see it. And for the first time in a long, lonely while, Maggie felt something stir beneath the fear, the faintest breath of safety. But it didn't last. Nothing safe ever lasted long in Coyote Bend. And as Wade's breath hitched with rage, and as the saloon's onlookers began to whisper, Maggie felt a cold certainty settle in her bones. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The gun smoke hadn't even settled when heavy boots pounded across the saloon porch. Sheriff Elias Hart burst through the batwing doors, one hand on his holster, the other steadying himself against the frame. His breath came fast, eyes scanning the room like a man expecting a corpse. Instead, he found a scene frozen in strange stillness. Luke Carver, standing calm as stone. Wade Kincaid, cradling a bleeding arm, and Maggie Cole, pale as unbleached linen, behind the stranger who had saved her. What in God's name? Hart began, but his eyes caught Wade's handprints on Maggie's arm, the bruises blooming like dark flowers. Maggie swallowed hard. Everyone waited Luke, the barkeep, the two drinkers, pretending not to watch. Her voice barely reached the air, but she forced it out. "He dragged me in here," she said. "I did not come willing." The tremor in her tone shook the silence apart. She didn't look at Wade. She didn't dare look at Luke. Instead, she pressed her palm against the banister to keep from shaking. Sheriff Hart's jaw tightened. For years, folks had whispered about Wade, his temper, his hands, his father smoothing things over. But whispers weren't evidence. Today was different. He stepped toward Wade. "You're going to Doc Keller. Now," Wade sputtered. "He shot me. You pulled first," Luke said quietly. The barkeep hesitated, looking from Wade to Maggie, then to the sheriff. Hart's tone sharpened. "Jim, say what you saw." Jim's shoulders slumped. His voice was low but clear enough. The lady was fighting them. She didn't walk in here on her own 2 feet. A ripple went through the room. Relief, disbelief, fear, all tangled like the dust motes drifting in the light. Wade glared murder at them all, but he couldn't argue. He pressed a cloth to his bleeding arm, cursing under his breath as the sheriff marched him out the door. Outside, Main Street had already gathered a crowd. Folks stood in tight knots, shopkeepers, wives, miners, ranch hands, talking under their breath as Wade stumbled past them, cursing and clutching his arm. Luke followed behind, slow and watchful, like a man ready to draw again if needed. Maggie stayed in the doorway, though the sunlight stung her eyes. People stared, some with sympathy, some with fear that trouble had finally boiled over. A few even looked grateful. Someone had finally stood up to Wade Kincaid. But gratitude was dangerous in a town like Coyote Bend. She felt the weight of every glance. Shame crawled up her throat. Respectable women didn't get dragged into saloons. Respectable women didn't stand shaking in the doorway of one. She gathered her scattered linens from the dirt and walked away without speaking, her boots crunching hard against the ground. Back in her wash house, she plunged her hands into the steaming basin, scrubbing until her knuckles reddened. The rhythm steadied her breathing scrub. Rinse, wring, but each motion carried a bite. Why did this happen? How many saw? What will the town say? Yet beneath the shame, something else simmered. Anger. Hot. Bright. Waking anger. She didn't invite trouble. She didn't step into that alley. She didn't deserve the grip that bruised her or the whispers that would follow. The door creaked softly. Luke Carver stood in the doorway, hat in his hands, like he wasn't sure he had any right to be there. "I wasn't going to ride on," he said. "Not after what I saw." Maggie held the wet linens to her chest, warmth rising in her face, not from embarrassment, but from the unfamiliar ache of someone caring. "Thank you," she managed, voice small. "I don't know how to repay." "Don't need repaying," he said gently. "Just needed to be done." He didn't stay long, didn't ask questions, didn't hover. He simply tipped his hat and stepped back into the evening sun, the dust lifting around his boots like smoke. She watched him go until he disappeared past the mercantile. For the first time that day, the washhouse felt too quiet, but the quiet didn't last. Near dusk, carriage wheels crunched to a halt outside her door, slow, deliberate, expensive. Judge Eben Kincaid stepped down, coat dark as raven feathers, silver watch chain glinting at his waist. His boots clicked on the porch with the confidence of a man who owned half the county and thought the other half owed him something. Mistress Cole. He greeted politely, removing his hat. His voice was warm enough, but his eyes were colder than the desert night. She stood straight. Judge, I heard there was unpleasantness today involving my son. He sighed like a disappointed father, not a frightened man. Wade has a fiery temper, a regrettable trait. Maggie crossed her arms to hide her bruises. He dragged me, she said evenly, into the saloon. Yes, he murmured, gaze drifting around her tidy workroom. So I've been told. His eyes landed on her washtubs, her folded fabrics, her iron stove. A hard-working woman, he said softly, independent. Then, with a colder note, though independence in Coyote Bend can be fragile. Maggie felt the air tighten. The judge stepped closer, not threatening, but towering, in the way powerful men often were. Your washhouse, as I recall, sits on land secured by a loan from my bank. She stiffened. That loan, he continued, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from his coat, was extended at my discretion. Renewed last spring, if memory serves. On favorable terms. Maggie's pulse thudded in her throat. Judge Kincaid offered her a thin smile. I'd hate to reconsider those terms because of today's misunderstanding. The word hung heavy between them, a warning wrapped in courtesy, a threat dressed up as regret. He tipped his hat with perfect manners, as though he hadn't just promised to ruin her livelihood if she dared say another word against his son. Good evening, Mistress Cole. He left her standing alone in the doorway, the fading sun throwing long shadows across her washhouse floorboards, shadows that felt colder than Wade's grip. Maggie shut the door slowly, her hands trembling again. But this time, not from fear alone, from the dawning certainty that defending herself might cost her everything she'd managed to build, and from the quiet, unsettling thought that the man who saved her Luke Carver might now be drawn into the storm she never asked for. The next morning broke warm and dusty, sunlight pushing over the mesas like a slow tide. Coyote Bend woke with its usual quiet, a hammer ringing out at the blacksmith shed, a rooster crowing stubbornly from behind the livery barn, a wagon rolling somewhere down Main Street. Luke Carver walked through it all with the gait of a man who had nowhere to be, but everywhere to think. His long shadow stretched ahead of him, stirred at the edges by the grit the wind kept kicking up. He wasn't a stranger to the west. He'd crossed 3 territories and half a dozen towns, just like this one. They always held the same things: a saloon, a church, a sheriff, and a man with too much power using it the wrong way. At the livery stable, he checked on his horse, an aging bay mare with the patient eyes of a creature who'd seen him through worse than saloon shootings. How long you stayin'? The stable boy asked, brushing the horse's flank. Don't know yet, Luke replied. Most folks don't pick fights with the Kincaids, the boy muttered, not looking at him. Folks that do tend to move on quick. Luke didn't answer. He didn't need to. His hand lingered on the mare's neck a moment longer before stepping back out onto the street. He stopped next at the blacksmith shop. The smith, a burly man named Ben Crowder, lifted his head from the anvil when Luke entered. You're the fella from yesterday, Grant said, wiping sweat from his brow. Got half the town talking. Heard you were quicker than Wade could blink? Not quick enough to avoid trouble, Luke said quietly. You looking for work? The smith asked. Could use another strong back. Maybe? Luke paused, eyeing the forge fire. What can you tell me about the Kincaid's Grant's hammer, frozen place? They own the land the saloon sits on, he said slowly. Half the shops, the bank. Judge Kincaid signs off on most legal matters in town. His boy keeps folks nervous. Luke already knew that. He'd seen how men stepped aside for Wade the same way they'd once stepped aside for drunken officers back in the cavalry camp's men who could destroy a life with nothing more than a mood swing. Appreciate the honesty, Luke murmured. Grant nodded once. Just be careful. Luke stepped outside again, trying to shake the feeling pressing tight behind his ribs. That old instinct the one drilled into him during the war was whispering again. Help? Then move on. Don't let roots tangle your boots. Don't give this place any more of you than yesterday already took. But something about Maggie's face wouldn't leave him. The bruises shaping her skin. The way she had stood in front of the sheriff with her voice shaking but her chin lifted. He walked toward the sheriff's office before he realized he was doing it. Sheriff Elias Hart was standing on the porch, adjusting the badge on his vest like a man who wished it weighed less heavy. I heard you were asking around, Hart said. Figured we ought to talk. I didn't come to stir trouble, Luke replied. Trouble was already stirred. Sheriff Hart let out a tired breath. You did right. Carver. The whole town knows it, but right don't mean safe. You crossed the judge yesterday, whether you meant to or not. Luke stayed silent. Hart lowered his voice. This town belongs to Judge Kincaid on paper. I can keep the peace, but I can't make it. I can't fight him head on, not unless the whole town stands with me. And most folks have families to feed. Luke looked past him toward the dusty street stretching out of town, freedom in one direction and a mess in the other. I've seen your kind, Hart said quietly. Men who help, then ride on so the trouble doesn't stick to 'em. Can't say I blame you. Luke didn't answer. He wasn't sure he knew the answer himself. Across town, Maggie Cole scrubbed linens with a force that left her arms aching. She needed the work today more than ever. But the knock came anyway. The boarding house owner stood stiffly on her porch, hat twisting in his hands. Miss Cole, he said, eyes lowering. I'm afraid we gotta cancel our weekly contract with you. The judge, well, he's concerned about the company you've been keeping. Maggie felt the sting like a slap. Another shopkeeper visited later, saying nearly the same thing. Nothing personal, he whispered, eyes darting around. I just can't risk upsetting the judge. By late afternoon, the washhouse felt hollow, echoing between her heartbeat and the ache in her chest. She found herself walking to the tiny clapboard chapel at the end of Pine Street. No one else was inside. Dust floated in the shafts of light that pierced the stained glass windows. She slipped onto the third pew and folded her hands. No long prayer came, no polished words, just, Lord, I'm so tired of being afraid. Her whisper disappeared into the wooden rafters, where only silence answered. It was nearly sunset when Luke found her. He stood at the chapel door with his hat in hand again, a habit she was starting to recognize as respect rather than caution. I'm riding out at first light, he said. Her breath caught. Because of the judge. Because of you, Luke corrected softly. I stay. And things get worse for you. It's how men like Kincaid work. Maggie stared at him, feeling her heartbeat thud once, twice, like it wanted to step closer, even when her body didn't move. All my life, Luke said quietly, I've tried to keep trouble from settling on folks who didn't ask for it. Best way to do that is to ride on. She stepped toward him, small but steady. They'll still come, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Whether you're here or not. Luke blinked, swallowed, looked away. Maggie reached for his gaze, holding it. The difference is, she said, now I know what it looks like when someone refuses to look away. Her words hit him like a bullet he never saw coming. Not sharp, just true. And truth hurt in a different way. Luke realized then that leaving wouldn't save her. It would only make him exactly what he feared most. A man who rode away from the people who needed him. He closed his eyes, a long breath filling his chest. Maybe, he murmured, I should have kept riding. But you didn't, she said softly. Outside, the last of the sun slipped behind the ridge, leaving the chapel doorway awash in deepening shadow. Luke didn't move. Maggie didn't either. And somewhere between them, between fear, pride, and the quiet truth of needing someone, something shifted, something they would both have to face. Soon. Night settled over Coyote Bend like a heavy blanket, thick with the smell of dust and the far-off hint of sage. Most houses along the single stretch of Main Street blew out their lamps early. Folks slept light in this town light because the nights carried whispers, and whispers carried names, most of them belonging to the Kincaids. Behind Maggie Cole's cabin, a small lantern burned low inside the washhouse shed. She'd left it glowing to dry the last of the shirts she'd wrung out that afternoon. The light flickered against the thin wooden slats, casting gentle shapes across the ground, like it was keeping watch. The wind pushed through the narrow alley, sending scraps of tumbleweed skittering. Then another shape moved quiet, deliberate, too slow to be blown by breeze. A man's boots stepped into the lantern's reach. He paused, glancing left, then right, confident no eyes were on him. He pulled a small tin from his coat. The sharp odor of kerosene filled the night air as he tilted the can, letting the liquid glisten across the back wall of the washhouse. He stepped back, struck a match. The flame danced yellow, eager, hungry. Then he tossed it. Fire caught with a dry hiss, climbing up the timbers, like a living thing that had been waiting for its chance. The man stepped into the shadows again, vanishing as the fire whispered itself into a roar. Across the street, Luke Carver lay in the stable loft, hat covering his eyes, quilt barely catching at his shoulders. Sleep came fitfully for him. Too many nights spent listening for trouble on campaign. Too many memories that didn't fade when the sun went down. When he first smelled the smoke, he thought it was a dream he'd had, back in the war, a burning barn, soldiers shouting. Then he heard the crack of splitting wood. He sat up fast, boots hitting the dusty boards as he scrambled toward the ladder. The stable boy was already yelling from below, pointing at the orange glow rising behind Maggie's place. Luke didn't think. He grabbed the nearest bucket, kicked open the stable door, and ran straight into the wind. Ben Crowder, the blacksmith, appeared from his shop with a shovel in one hand and a water barrel he rolled clumsily with the other. Which parts caught? He shouted. Shed. Luke barked back. The fire had already wrapped itself around the washhouse like a snake. Flames licked up the back wall, sending sparks climbing into the alleyway. Heat rolled out in waves, strong enough to sting Luke's face. Ben filled buckets from the barrel, passing them as fast as he could. Luke threw water, again and again, eyes burning, arms aching. But the shed was dry. Timber, old timber, and it went up too fast. Get the cabin, Luke yelled. If we lose that, she's done for together. They formed a desperate, stumbling line, Ben passing buckets, Luke throwing them over the cabin wall, drenching the boards until they dripped. The fire snapped at the edge of the roof shingles, but couldn't quite get a hold. By the time the flames died down, dawn was faintly brushing across the hills. Smoke curled like dark ribbons into the pale sky. The shed collapsed in on itself with a final groan, and the last of the fire flickered into dying embers. Luke stood over the ruins, chest heaving. shirt soaked with sweat and soot. Ben leaned on his shovel, coughing hard, where the wash house once stood, where Maggie had scrubbed, rinsed, wrung out clothes. Day after day, there was nothing but blackened beams and melted metal tubs, half sunk in ash. Her livelihood, burned to a skeleton. By mid-morning, half the town had passed by Maggie's fence. Some looked with pity, some with fear, most with the blank stare of people wishing they didn't see what they were seeing. A few women paused long enough for their eyes to grow wet, but none dared step through the gate. Maggie stood in the yard, hands knotted together so tight her knuckles went white. Her throat ached. Her mind felt hollow, stunned. She didn't cry. Maybe she'd used up all her tears years ago. A buggy pulled up around noon. A narrow-faced man stepped down, clutching a folded paper against his vest. "Miss Cole," he said stiffly. "Yes, I'm Clerk Addison, representin' Judge Eben Kincaid's office. I regret to inform you that due to the damage inflicted upon your collateral, the bank must call in your loan early." Maggie felt the world tilt, just a little. "Early? Yes, ma'am." His voice held no softness. "Payment due in full within 30 days. My wash house burned down last night," she whispered. "How am I supposed to—" "That is precisely why the judge is—" He paused as though choosing the least offensive lie, concerned about the security of his investment. He set the folded paper in her hand and walked away without another word. Maggie stared at the paper until the letters blurred. Her fingers trembled, not out of fear but from something deeper, something twisting itself into steel. Luke approached from behind, wiping ash from his arms. "I can help," he said quietly. "Got a little saved. Not much, but something." She shook her head hard. "I won't take charity." "It ain't charity," he said, voice low. "It's fairness. You've been hit 'cause of me." She lifted her chin. "No, I was hit because of them. That's different." Luke looked at her a long moment, something like respect warming his tired eyes. "Then let me help rebuild. Just the labor." She hesitated, but not long. "That I'll take." They worked in silence for a while, clearing debris, stacking what could be saved, pushing aside what couldn't. The sun climbed high, baking the ash until it crackled underfoot. At last, Maggie stood before the charred line where the wash-house wall used to be. She held a new wooden post. Ben had brought it from his shop and set it upright in the earth. Her hands shook only for a second. Then she raised the hammer and drove it down. The sound echoed sharp and clean, a defiance ringing through the quiet yard. Another swing, another, each one steadier than the last. "I'm not leaving," she said softly, breath-catching. "Judge or no judge." Luke didn't answer. He didn't need to. He stepped beside her, lifted a second post, and began shaping the frame of a new wall one plank at a time. The smoke had barely faded. The ashes were still warm, but something new was already rising in its place, something stronger than fear. The sound reached town before the dust did, heavy, rhythmic, metallic, a pound, then another, echoing across the hard pan like slow thunder. Out on the edge of Coyote Bend, Judge Kincaid's stamp mill was chewing through rock again, smashing ore into powder that shimmered like gold under the sun. Folks said the judge could hear the money singing from miles away. But what the people downstream heard was something else entirely. They heard the creek dying. It began with a slight dip in the public trough, beside Maggie's rebuilt wash-house frame, just an inch or two the first day. Barely noticeable unless you were watching. By the end of the week, the water was low enough that horses snorted in frustration, scraping the bottom with their teeth. Another day passed, and all that trickled out was mud the color of old coffee. Children stood with empty pails. Women whispered about walking farther upriver. Ranchers cursed under their breath as their cattle crowded at shrinking pools along the ditch. Nobody said the judge's name out loud, but everyone knew. Maggie stood by the trough, brow furrowed as she dipped a hand into the shallow pool. Warm, muddy water clung to her fingers. She wiped it on her apron, feeling the familiar coil of anger stir in her chest. "That's new," she muttered. Luke, leaning against a fence post, nodded. "Creek's been tampered with. How can you tell water always tells on the man who moves it?" he said quietly. "Changes the way it settles." Maggie didn't ask how he knew. The war had taught him more things than a man ought to carry. By noon, word had spread. Corn patches were wilting on farms just outside town. Cattle were growing restless. Ben Crowder's well had dropped 3 inches overnight, leaving him stunned and muttering into his beard. "It ain't rainin'." "I know that," he grumbled, slamming the lid on the well. "But this ain't lack of rain. This is theft." The Reverend Elliot Marsh heard confessions all afternoon, soft, strained voices whispering about temptations to violence, dark thoughts gnawing at the edges of their patience. "Lord, forgive me," one man said, hat twisted in his hands. "But if I catch one of those Kincaid men near my field, I don't know what I'll do." Reverend Marsh didn't blame him. He felt the same pressure building in the pews, like a storm trapped inside wood walls. Luke saddled his mare as the sun dipped behind the ridge. He rode north, following the dry creek bed, until he saw the newly dug ditch. It cut through the land like a wound. Fresh soil piled on both sides. Footprints still visible, where workmen had trampled through. A glitter of water shimmered in a channel that hadn't existed 2 days ago. Luke dismounted, crouching beside the split in the creek. A headgate of rough timber blocked the main flow, forcing the water toward a ditch running straight to the judge's mill. "They're starvin' the town," he whispered. Movement flickered near the headgate. Luke's hand drifted toward his revolver, but he didn't draw. 3 men lounged on crates nearby, rifles leaning against their knees. They weren't farmers. Their boots were too new, their hats too clean. Hired guns, no doubt. Luke backed away slowly, careful not to draw attention. There wasn't a single man in Coyote Bend who could take on 3 rifles and the judge's wrath in the same breath. Not yet. Twilight settled, blue and low over town. Maggie lit a lantern in her half-rebuilt wash-house frame, the yellow light flickering across the charred ground. Luke found her there. Stacking unburned boards she'd scavenged from behind the blacksmith shop. "They've blocked the creek," he said quietly. She didn't stop working. "I figured. Hired guns watching the headgate." She swallowed, lifting another plank. "Of course they are." He studied her face, waiting for fear or despair to show. But what he saw instead was something harder, something forged in the same fire that had taken her wash-house. "You should know," he continued. "The town's scared, not just talk scared, hungry scared, dry scared." Her eyes flickered. "What are we supposed to do? Drink dust?" Luke leaned against a post, running a hand along the unfinished frame. "Maybe time we stopped pretendin' this ain't war." She looked at him sharply. "War the kind fought from shadows first," he said. "Before shots ring." His words hung heavy between them. A moment later, Ben Crowder approached, hat in hand. "Reverend wants a word," he said. "Says it's important." Maggie wiped her hands on her apron. Luke grabbed the lantern. Together, the 3 of them walked toward the chapel. The chapel sat quiet at the end of Pine Street, its paint peeling in the gentle way of buildings that survived more on hope than on lumber. Inside, Reverend Marsh waited near the pulpit, coat draped over a chair, sleeves rolled to his elbows like he'd been wrestling with his own worries. "You came," he said softly, as they filed in. "Thank you." Luke set the lantern on the table. "What's this about?" Marsh laced his fingers together. "The town is breaking. Folks confess things they never would have said a month ago. They're scared. They're thirsty. And they believe there's no fightin' a man who owns the law." Maggie lowered herself into a pew, feeling the weight of the day settle across her shoulders. "I don't ask for trouble," she said. "Never have. But trouble seems to find me just fine." The Reverend gave a sad smile. "Because you're one of the few who hasn't learned to bow," Ben grunted. "Judge picks us off one by one. Maggie's shed, my well, Hank's corn, who's next?" Marsh nodded gravely. "If we all keep standing alone, he'll take everything from us." Silence wrapped the chapel like a blanket thick, suffocating, but waiting for someone to make the first tear. Maggie looked at Luke. His eyes were on her, quiet and steady, not pushing, not leading, just waiting like whatever choice she made. He'd follow. Her throat tightened. She wasn't a leader. She wasn't a fighter. She was a laundress with ruined tools and alone being squeezed to death. But she was done being afraid. She rose slowly to her feet, hands trembling, not with fear, but with clarity. "Then we stop standing alone," she said. The words came out soft but carried through the chapel like a bell. Luke let out a long, quiet breath. Ben straightened his back. Reverend Marsh closed his eyes for a moment, as though thanking God for a spark he hadn't dared hope for. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like distant applause. Inside, the air changed. Maggie felt it. Luke felt it. All of them did. A beginning small, fragile, but real and dangerous. By late afternoon, word had already spread across Main Street that Reverend Marsh wanted folks to gather at the chapel after sunset. He called it a prayer meeting. But no one was fooled. Prayer wasn't the thing simmering in Coyote Bend these days. Fear was, thirst was, anger was too quiet, low, waiting for breath. As dusk settled, lantern light glowed through the warped windows of the old clapboard chapel. One by one, ranchers stepped inside, brushing dust off their coats. Shopkeepers closed their shutters early. Mothers arrived with tired children in tow. Old miners with lungs full of grit shuffled into the back pews, coughing into handkerchiefs. The room filled faster than anyone expected. Luke Carver slipped in last, leaning against the back wall, arms crossed. It was the kind of room he usually avoided, crowded, anxious, full of people wanting answers he wasn't sure he had. Small-town worry carried a different weight than wartime worry. War at least had rules. This sort of fear lived in the eyes of people who had nowhere else to go. Reverend Marsh stepped forward, resting both hands on the pulpit. His voice was gentle at first. "Brothers and sisters, we all know why we're here." A murmur rippled through the pews. The Reverend continued, "Water hasn't reached half the town in 3 days. 2 families are down to their last barrels. Cattle are starting to wander into each other's pastures. People are scared, and it ain't because of drought. Someone in the front spoke up. Ain't nothing we can do. Judge Kincaid controls every drop, always has." A man to the left added, "He feeds half the town and owns your note," another said bitterly. "And yours and mine." The room buzzed, voices rising and overlapping like bees trapped in a box. Fear swelled with each confession. Luke shifted his weight, jaw tightening. He'd stood in rooms like this before, rooms where good folk whispered about doing the right thing while hoping someone else might do it for them. It never ended well. From her place, near the middle pew, Maggie remained quiet, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes stayed down, posture calm, but Luke could see tension in every line of her body. Then a voice from the far right pew cut through the noise. Well, maybe if the woman had been minding her own path, she wouldn't have been dragged where she didn't belong. Silence snapped through the room. Maggie's head snapped up. Her breath froze. A wash of heat rose up Luke's neck. But no one said anything. No one defended her. They just watched, shifting in their seats. The man who spoke Tom Greeley, a ranch hand known for having more opinions than cattle leaned back, arms folded, smug. Respectable women don't wander near saloons. He said, just saying. Maggie stood. The simple act was enough to still even the restless children. Her voice, when it came, was steady, not loud, not soft, just true. I wasn't wandering anywhere. I was delivering linens to the boarding house. Wade Kincaid followed me. He grabbed me, dragged me. I didn't step so much as 1 foot across that saloon's threshold by choice. The room held its breath. Maggie took a slow step forward, eyes moving across faces she'd known for years. Faces that turned away when trouble rose. Faces that stayed silent even now. I didn't scream, she continued. I didn't beg. I didn't cause a scene because I knew no one would have helped me. Not until someone who didn't know me at all walked through those doors and refused to look away. Her voice trembled, not from shame, but from the weight of truth long unspoken. If it had been your daughter, she said, gaze settling hard on Tom Greeley, would you still call it a misunderstanding? A shock ran through the room, so real it felt like the temperature dropped. Greeley's mouth opened, then closed, and his eyes slid to the floor. No one moved. Then an old man near the aisle cleared his throat. Hank Calloway, 60 if he was a day, with knotted hands and a back bent from years leaning over fence rails shifted forward. I ain't got much, he said, voice rough as gravel, but I'll stand with that. He didn't look at Maggie. He didn't make a speech. He just said it like a man saying grace. 2 other ranchers nodded. A storekeeper wiped his mouth with his sleeve and echoed, reckon she's right. Even a few of the mothers, holding babies half asleep on their shoulders, murmured agreement. The line in the sand wasn't bold. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even straight. But it was there. And it was more than Coyote Bend had dared draw in years. Luke watched the shift happen subtle, but undeniable. Something in him loosened. Maybe the first thread of hope. Maybe just relief that Maggie wasn't standing alone anymore. Reverend Marsh let out a breath he'd been holding. Then it starts here, he whispered, with small courage. No one prayed after that. No hymn was sung. People simply sat, breathing the same air for the first time without looking over their shoulders. And as they trickled out, lanterns flickering in their hands, a new heaviness settled in the room, the kind that came before storms, the kind that brought lightning. Luke stayed in the back, watching Maggie as she stood alone for a moment, gathering herself. She looked tired, but not defeated. When she finally turned toward the door, Luke stepped forward, not speaking, just walking beside her as they left the chapel together. Outside, the night wind carried the faint scent of dust and something else. Change, real change. Still small, still risky, still fragile, but alive. Sheriff Elias Hart left before sunrise, riding east toward Fort Dry River, with nothing but a canteen, a tired horse. Vahi vung, buchipi I, mung theo, du trai tim kong tin, vau no. The sky was still bruised purple when he crossed the first ridge. By late morning, the sun turned the desert hard and bright, and heat rippled off the sand like glass. The sheriff knew every mile of that 15-mile ride. He also knew every mile of it would probably be wasted. Judge Kincaid had long arms, longer than the law cared to admit. Hart arrived at the fort coated in dust, feeling every year of the job wearing on his shoulders. The Union flag hung limp over the walls, and soldiers lounged in the yard, sharpening blades or smoking, looking more bored than ready. The commander, Captain Harlan Briggs, met him outside the office. Briggs was a polished man, clean boots, pressed coat, eyes that betrayed nothing except an eagerness to be done with inconvenience. Hart explained the water diversion, the violence brewing, Wade's assault on a civilian woman, the hired guns, the fear crawling through Coyote Bend. Briggs listened with polite boredom, as if hearing a weather report. When Hart finished, Briggs clasped his hands behind his back. "Sheriff, I sympathize with your situation, truly, but this sounds like a civil water dispute." Hart's jaw tightened. "There are men with rifles guarding the new ditch. Private property." Briggs replied smoothly, "If we intervened every time a rancher or a businessman diverted a creek, we'd spend all year arbitrating arguments best left to local authorities." Hart felt something in him sink. "And if it turns violent," Briggs sighed, "then report it to the territorial marshal. If he orders us, we'll step in. But until then, my hands are tied." The sheriff stared at him. "It'll be too late by then." Briggs didn't flinch. "Then let's pray it doesn't come to that." Hart stepped back, hat in hand, fury twisting in his gut. Never knew prayer was part of Army protocol. Briggs tilted his head, already turning away. "Only when it keeps us from unnecessary paperwork." Back in Coyote Bend, the wind carried more trouble than dust. 3 strangers rode into town by midday, hard-eyed, clean-booted men with polished revolvers and matching expressions of quiet menace. They tied their horses near the saloon and walked into Kincaid's office like they already owned the street. Folks noticed. They always noticed new gun hands, especially ones who didn't wear their grime honest. Maggie noticed, too. She was carrying a bundle of linens to the blacksmith's forge when she heard her name spoken behind her softly, too softly for comfort. "Miss Cole." Wade Kincaid stepped into her path, arm still bound in a sling, face paler than usual. The whiskey confidence hadn't returned, but another kind of boldness had one built from pride, limping on fear. "I've been meaning to speak with you," he said, voice dipped in syrup he didn't know how to use. Maggie stiffened. "I don't want a word from you." "Now, hold on," Wade said, smiling like a man reading a script. "I reckon I behaved poorly that day. Real poorly. I was drinking. You surprised me. Things got mixed up." She stepped away. He stepped closer. "You know how folks talk," he murmured. "Wouldn't want rumors hurtin' your reputation. I'm willing to forget what happened, if you are." Her breath hitched, not in fear, but in disbelief. Forget Wade's voice dropped to a whisper edged with threat. "It'd be best." Before Maggie could answer, a shadow shifted near the forge. Luke Carver stepped into view. He didn't reach for his gun, didn't take a threatening step. He just stood there. Solid, silent, eyes fixed on Wade with a calm that made Wade's face go blotchy. Wade swallowed. This ain't your business. Luke didn't blink. Everything is my business when you corner a woman alone. Wade's jaw twitched. He looked from Maggie to Luke, then spat on the ground. This ain't over, Miss Cole, he muttered, not by a long shot. He backed away, trying not to limp, disappearing between the buildings with a stiff swagger that fooled no one. Maggie exhaled shakily, shoulders slumping as the air left her lungs. Luke approached slowly. You all right, I'm tired, she whispered. Tired of people thinking I'm helpless, or thinking I brought all this on myself. The sunlight softened around her, catching on the faint purple marks on her arm. Luke's expression changed something dark, something old rising behind his eyes. Folks like Wade don't stop, he said. They don't see people, just things they can hurt or own. She looked at him, searching his face. How do you know that Luke hesitated? For nights now, he'd skirted every mention of the war. He'd kept his stories packed tight behind his ribs, where gunshots and fire and guilt lived like permanent tenants. But something about Maggie, about her steadiness, her quiet courage, pulled the truth loose. He sat on the bench behind her cabin, the one he'd helped rebuild board by board. Maggie sat beside him, the evening wind brushing their shoulders. When I was with the cavalry, he said slowly, we passed a farmhouse once, smoke in the distance, too much noise coming from inside. I knew something was wrong. I knew it in my bones. Maggie listened without moving, but the lieutenant said, keep riding. We had orders. So I did. His voice thinned. We came back hours later. Found the place burned. Family gone. I stood in that ash and knew it was my fault. She turned toward him, really looked at him. Luke. He kept his gaze on the ground. Ever since then, I've tried not to get close to trouble, not to people. Makes riding on easier. But you didn't ride on this time. He finally met her eyes. No, he said, because this time I saw the fire before it started. And I'm not riding past this one. The words hung between them, heavy but certain like a promise carved into the night. A light wind lifted the edges of her shawl. Somewhere, a coyote yipped in the distance, the sound drifting like a warning or a reminder that wild things stand together or not at all. Maggie didn't answer right away. She let the quiet sit with them, let it breathe. Then she whispered, then neither am I. The night settled deeper. The threats had grown. The law had failed. But two people who had spent years surviving alone had finally chosen to stand. The moon over Coyote Bend rose thin and white, like a thumbnail scratch across the sky. It wasn't bright enough to comfort anyone, only bright enough to show the way to trouble. Luke Carver rode ahead, reins loose in one hand, eyes fixed on the narrow trail running beside the dry creek bed. Behind him came Hank Calloway, old but steady, Ben Crowder, the blacksmith, his broad shoulders hunched with purpose, and two young cowhands, Jesse and Nolan, both too green to know what fear really meant and too proud to admit it if they did. And then there was Maggie Cole. She walked beside Luke's horse, skirts tied up, lantern unlit in her hand. You shouldn't be here, Luke whispered for the 6th time. You don't get to be the only one who's not afraid anymore, Maggie murmured back. And you sure as heaven don't get to tell me when I matter. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Some truths stop arguments before they start. The group moved slowly, boots and hooves muffled in the dust, branches clawed at coats, coyotes cried from somewhere far off, their voices riding the wind like warnings. The creek, once a lively ribbon through Coyote Bend, was now a wounded line of mud and pebble. The judge's new diversion ditch had swallowed its life, but tonight, under the thin moon, They meant to take it back. Hank Calloway spat into the dust. Headgate's just around that bend. 2 guards, maybe 3, Ben grumbled. If they're even awake. Men guarding someone else's water sleep lighter than men guarding their own. Luke dismounted, tying his horse to a cottonwood root. Nobody fires unless they fire first. We're here to open the gate, not start a war. Jesse and Nolan nodded, knuckles tight around the crowbars they carried. The metal glinted under the moon. Maggie tugged her shawl tight against the night air. What do you need me to do? Luke hesitated. Every instinct in him screamed to send her back. But she was here because she had lost her livelihood, her safety, and her patience with fear. And because she trusted him. He pointed toward the brush near the guards' tethered horses. If those horses spook, the guards will rush to settle them, not look at us. Gives us seconds. That's all we need? Maggie nodded, jaw set. They split Maggie, slipping into the sagebrush, the men creeping toward the wooden headgate, a stout structure of thick timbers, iron bolts, and one heavy padlock that gleamed like a dare. Luke crouched low beside Hank. We break the lock. Open the gate. Water runs back to town before Kincaid even knows it's gone. Hank grinned. Reckon that'll sour his breakfast. Luke almost smiled. Almost. Then the night held its breath. A small fire burned near the headgate. 2 guards dozed under blankets, rifles leaning against a log. Their horses stamped occasionally, ears flicking. Maggie moved silently, keeping low, until she reached the brush near the horses. She pulled a smooth stone from her pocket. Luke watched from the dark, pulse pounding. She whispered a quiet prayer, then threw. The stone struck the flank of the nearest horse with a sharp thud. The animal squealed and reared, jerking its reins. The second horse startled, neighing and stomping, pulling against its tether. The guards jolted awake. What the easy, boy, settle down. Both men rushed to the horses, turning their backs to the headgate. Luke hissed. Now Ben and the boys lunged forward. One crowbar wedged into the lock's shackle. Another hammered against the side. Metal shrieked. The lock snapped like brittle bone. Luke heaved the gate lever upward. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then a roar. Water burst forward like a freed animal, rushing down the channel that had been starved for weeks. It leapt over stones, foamed white, clawing at the banks with a fury born of hunger. Go. Go, Luke shouted. We're done. But the noise of the water woke more than the creak. One guard spun, eyes wide, rifle already coming up. The moon caught the metal. A burst of fire split the night. Down, Ben yelled. Luke shoved Maggie, who had darted from the brush the moment she heard the shot, pushing her behind a cluster of rocks. More shouts. Another gunshot. The cowhands scrambled for cover. Hank cursed loudly. Luke drew his revolver but didn't fire. He refused to start the war they were trying to stop. Another shot cracked. Luke's body jerked. The sound he made wasn't loud, more like a breath being stolen mid-word. Maggie saw it happen, the way his boots slid on the rocks, the way his hand grasped at nothing, trying to hold onto the world as it tilted under him. Luke, she cried. He staggered toward the narrow ledge, running above the creek, now swollen with the surging rush of released water. He looked back at her once, eyes sharp with pain. Then his heel slipped, his body pitched backward, and Luke Carver fell into the darkness below. Maggie screamed, scrambling toward the edge, but Ben caught her arm. No, Maggie, no. She fought him, eyes wild. He's down there. He's in the water. The rushing creek below boiled and glinted, but showed nothing. No hat, no hand, no sign of him surfacing. Jesse shouted, We gotta move, more guards coming. Nolan tugged Maggie's sleeve. Miss Cole. Please, if they see us." Ben wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her away as dawn's first faint light crept over the hills. The head gate roared open behind them. The water ran free. But the place where Luke had fallen remained dark and silent. No one saw him surface. No one knew where the water had carried him. Maggie stumbled, breath broken, staring back at the shadows swallowing the creek. The sun rose on a victory paid for in blood, and Maggie realized for the first time since she'd buried her husband, her heart was breaking again. Dawn crept slowly over Coyote Bend, pale as skimmed milk, for the first time in weeks. The creek behind town ran full, swollen, and eager, rushing over stones with a voice the town had nearly forgotten. Livestock crowded the banks, drinking greedily. Children ran with tin cups, laughing at the sight of real water instead of mud. Fields soaked it up like thirsty hands. Corn leaves lifted. Dust settled. It should have been a morning of relief, but joy died the moment the riders returned. Hank Calloway rode in first, shoulders slumped, hat in his hands. Ben Crowder followed, face blackened with soot and misery. Jesse and Nolan trailed behind, their horses slow, eyes hollow. They came not as victors, but as men bearing something heavy, something they wished they didn't have to carry. Maggie stood in her yard, apron damp from rinsing linens, her fingers wrinkled from the wash buckets she had clung to since before sunrise. She saw their faces and felt the world tilt. Ben slid from his horse, boots unsteady. "Maggie," he whispered. "I'm sorry." Her throat tightened. "Where is he?" No one spoke. The silence was worse than words. Hank finally managed. "He took a bullet, high in the ribs. Tried to push you clear, lost his footing on the rocks. Creek was running wild. We looked. God knows we looked, but—" He shook his head, voice cracking like old timber. "All we found was blood on the stones." Maggie's breath fell apart. Not a gasp, not a cry. Just a slow collapsing inside her chest. Her hands slipped from her apron. Water dripped to the dust. Ben added softly, "We waited for him to surface. He never did. No body, no hat. Just the rushing water carrying him into darkness." Maggie closed her eyes, jaw trembling, but no tears came not yet. She had learned long ago that grief could be a slow-burning fire, one that didn't show its flames until nightfall. She nodded once, then turned away before anyone could reach for her, because touch, right now, would break her. She moved through the rest of the morning as if underwater, slow, heavy, distant. Her limbs worked on memory alone, hauling water from the newly revived trough, scrubbing shirts until her knuckles burned, hanging linens along the half-finished line Luke had helped her raise. Each motion was a lifeline, a ritual keeping her from collapsing. She caught herself glancing at the bench behind her cabin, the one where he'd sat just nights ago, telling her he wouldn't ride past trouble this time. The bench looked different now, too still, too empty. The wash buckets stood around her like silent witnesses. Even the wind felt wrong, gentle, almost pitying. By noon, the town buzzed with news of the headgate break. Judge Kincaid's fury traveled faster than the water. His new gun hands strutted through Main Street, rifles slung bold, spurs clicking sharp warnings into the dirt. They weren't hiding anymore. They wanted the town to feel the price of defiance, and the town did. Shopkeepers shut early, families kept children indoors, windows shuttered like eyelids squeezed shut in fear. Reverend Marsh stopped by Maggie's yard near afternoon, hat pressed to his chest. "We should hold a memorial," he said, voice gentle. "The town needs to grieve. So do you." Maggie shook her head. "He's not in the ground," she whispered, "and neither is what he started." The Reverend hesitated, weighing her grief, her steel. Then he nodded and left quietly, understanding that some prayers weren't meant for chapels, they were meant for the battlefield. Near dusk, as the sun settled red behind the ridge, women began drifting into Maggie's yard. First came Mrs. Crowder, wiping flour from her hands, then the widow Langley, stiff-backed with age, then Clara Greeley, Tom's wife, eyes shadowed with bruises that weren't from any fall, then two washerwomen Maggie had known for years, both hesitant, both determined, then more shopkeepers' wives, farm girls, mothers with infants bundled tight. No one had called them. No word had been passed. They just came. Maggie stood at the center of her yard, palms pressed against the cool wood of the new wash line. Lantern light flickered around them, brushing the women's faces with warm gold. One woman spoke first. "We heard about Luke." Another whispered, "We're sorry. Maggie." Maggie didn't break. She wouldn't not hear. "Thank you," she said simply. Mrs. Crowder stepped forward. The judge raised prices at the mill store again. "My youngest can't stomach the powdered flour anymore," Widow Langley muttered. "Sheriff says there's nothing he can do, but Wade and those gun hands walk around like wolves smelling blood." More voices joined. "My husband's scared to speak. The judge cut our hay allotment. My boy was threatened last night. Enough's enough." Maggie looked at them, really looked, and saw the same tightness she'd felt in her own chest these past weeks. Fear. Yes. But also a tiredness, so deep it had hardened into resolve. "These men," Clara Greeley whispered, "they think we'll always keep our heads down, serve their tables, wash their linens, bake their bread, smile when they want us to smile." Her voice trembled. "But we're the ones keeping this town alive." Ben's wife nodded. "If the men are slow to stand, maybe it's our turn." Maggie felt something stir inside her, something like the moment she'd raised that new post in the ashes of her wash house. Pain and purpose tangled together. "Then let's start," she said. Every face turned to her. No more washing for the judge's boarding rooms. No more shopping at his store. No more bending our backs so he can stand taller. A hush washed over the group. Maggie's voice deepened, quiet but fierce. "Tonight, we stop cooperating. And tomorrow, let the men see what courage looks like." Widow Langley lifted her chin. About time. For the first time since dawn, Maggie felt her knees stop shaking. The women stood together, lanterns glowing like small embers in the deepening dusk, tiny lights gathering in the dark. They weren't enough to win a war, not yet. But they were enough to keep a promise, enough to make Luke's stand live. And as the night settled around them, Maggie realized she wasn't holding her grief alone. It was being held by a circle of hands she hadn't known she could lean on. A circle forming the very thing Kincaid feared most: community. The letter came on a Wednesday, folded too neat to mean anything good. Sheriff Elias Hart stood at Maggie Cole's gate, hat in one hand, a crisp white envelope in the other. His eyes looked older than they had the week before. Maybe grief added years. Maybe guilt did, too. Maggie wiped her wet hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch. The morning sun caught the half-mended wash line, the hammer Luke had left hanging on a nail, the buckets that had stood still the day he disappeared. "Sheriff," she said quietly. "Miss Cole." Hart shifted his weight. "Judge's clerk dropped this at my office. Said it needed deliverin' by hand. He held it out. She didn't take it right away. Paper from Judge Kincaid had never brought anything but hurt." What is it? She asked. Foreclosure notice, Hart said, voice low. He's callin' your note. Says you're in default. Her jaw tightened. I'm not. I've made every payment. Wash house burned, Hart replied. His words, not mine. Collateral diminished. Risk unacceptable. He swallowed. He's startin' with your plot. Maggie took the envelope. The edge was sharp against her fingers. For a moment, she imagined tearing it to shreds, letting the pieces blow down Main Street like white leaves. Instead, she unfolded it and scanned the lines. Legal words marching like soldiers, all under Judge Kincaid's name. Effective immediately, she whispered. Vacate the property within 3 days. Hart cleared his throat. He expects me to enforce it. And will you? He looked up then, meeting her eyes. I'll bring the papers, but I won't lay a hand on your door or your fence. If he wants you carried out, he'll have to find other arms. Maggie studied him for a long moment. That might cost you your badge. Badges can be replaced, Hart said. A man's own face in the mirror. That's harder. She folded the notice, slid it into her apron pocket, and nodded. Thank you for bringing it straight. He tipped his hat and stepped back toward the street. Word spreads fast in a town this size. He said, be ready for company. He was right. By noon, people started drifting toward Maggie's place at the edge of town. Some came out of loyalty, Ben Crowder, wiping his hands on a blackened rag as he closed the forge. Hank Calloway, leaning more heavily than usual on his stick but walking with purpose. Reverend Marsh, Bible under his arm. Determination where gentleness usually lived. Others came out of curiosity. They hung back near fence posts and wagon wheels, whispering. Some came because they expected a fight. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed, watching adults forget how to pretend everything was fine. Maggie stood near her low fence, the one Luke had helped repair, her shoulders squared, hands steady at her sides. The notice felt hot against her hip, where it rested in her apron pocket. In the distance, dust rose along the road, the kind of dust that meant more than a wagon or a lone rider. Judge Eben Kincaid rode at the front, suit immaculate despite the trail, white hair catching the light. Beside him rode Wade, sling gone, arm stiff but usable, face twisted into a knot of bitterness. 3 hired gunmen followed, rifles sheened and ready, eyes flat and bored, like this was just another day of work. They drew up in front of Maggie's yard, horses stamping, metal bits clinking. Judge Kincaid looked down at her over his gloved hand. Miss Cole, he said, voice smooth as ever. I trust you've read the notice. I have, she replied. Then you know, he said, this land now falls under the bank's authority. You are in default. I am here to reclaim my property. Maggie glanced back at the cabin, the half-built wash shed, the line where Luke's hands had driven posts into the ground. This land's had more of my sweat than your ink, she said. Seems to me that should count for something. Sentiment, Kincaid replied, is not currency. He turned to the gun hands. Remove trespassers and clear the buildings. We'll have crews in by week's end. The hired men nudged their horses forward. Sheriff Hart stepped out from the gathered crowd, moving to stand between the gunman and Maggie's fence. His hand rested on his revolver, thumb just under the strap. You'll have to go through me. Eben, he said. His voice shook a little, but his boots stayed planted. Kincaid's eyes cooled a few degrees. Careful, Sheriff. You're sworn to uphold the law, not defy it. I am, Hart said. But there's law, and there's what you write on paper. I took an oath to both. You've been stretching one long enough. I won't help you break the other. One of the gun hands smirked. Step aside, lawman. Hart didn't move. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Fear, admiration, worry. It all rolled together like storm clouds. Ben Crowder walked forward then, crossing from the safe side of the street to Maggie's yard. He stepped over the low fence and took his place beside her. Hank Calloway followed, leaning hard on his stick as he crossed the line. He winced at each step, but his jaw was set. Old legs still work, he muttered, good enough to stand. Reverend Marsh crossed next, eyes steady. Seems to me, he said calmly. If this is bank property now, it belongs to the people whose lives it holds, not just the man whose name is on the deed. A dozen women joined them, Mrs. Da Crowder, Widow Langley, Clara Greeley, and others' children, peeking out from behind their skirts. One by one, they crossed Maggie's fence as if stepping over a line inside themselves. Kincaid's gaze swept over the little crowd. This is foolishness, he said. You risk everything for a woman who cannot even keep up her payments. Maggie lifted her chin. I kept up every one until you sent your fire and your thieves. You have no proof, he replied coldly. Don't need proof to know what I felt, she said, or who benefits. For a moment, the air seemed to solidify. Dust swirled lazily between the horse's legs. A fly buzzed near Kincaid's hat and thought better of landing. Trigger fingers twitched. The whole town seemed to narrow down to the width of Maggie's fence. Last chance, Kincaid said. Step aside. Go home. Those of you with mortgages and accounts, consider what you stand to lose. No one moved. Ben's hand brushed Maggie's arm. Reckon we already lost too much? He said quietly. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. One gun hand shifted in his saddle, eyes narrowing. Wade's fingers twitched near his holster. Sheriff Hart's knuckles went white. Then someone at the edge of the crowd yelled, Rider comin'! Every head turned. At the far end of the road, a single horse plodded toward town. Not in a gallop, not in triumph, just a slow, determined walk. The rider slumped in the saddle, held there by stubbornness alone. For a heartbeat, no one recognized him. Distance and dust made him another weary stranger, but as the horse drew closer, details sharpened into cruel clarity. Bandages wrapped his chest beneath an open shirt. His face was leaner, shadowed, eyes sunken, but burning with a familiar tired fire. Luke Carver. Someone whispered his name. Someone else crossed themselves, like seeing a ghost. He reined in a few yards from the standoff, gaze moving from Maggie's fence to Judge Kincaid, to the gun hands bristling around him. His eyes were haunted, but they were open, awake, alive. Maggie's hand flew to her mouth. For the first time in days, tears came hot, shocking, undeniable. Luke eased himself out of the saddle, boots hitting the dirt with a soft, painful thud. He put a hand on the horse's neck to steady himself, then straightened as much as his battered ribs allowed. He looked at Maggie, then at the townsfolk standing on her side of the fence. Then he looked at Kincaid. I must have hit my head harder than I thought, Luke rasped, voice rough with river water and pain. Last I remember, this town wasn't brave enough to stand in front of a fence. The tension didn't vanish, but it changed, and every finger, on every trigger, suddenly felt the weight of a man who had already fallen into darkness, and climbed back out. If Coyote Bend had breath that morning, it held it, now caught tight in its chest as Luke Carver slid one shaky boot to the dirt. He held the saddle horn longer than a man would if he weren't hurting, but he didn't hide it. He wasn't trying to look strong. He was just trying to stand. Maggie stepped instinctively toward him, but Luke lifted one hand, palm steady, though the rest of him shook. "I'm all right," he rasped. "Just took the long way home." Wade Kincaid stared at him like a ghost had walked out of the creek. The hired guns shifted uneasily. Judge Kincaid's face paled beneath the brim of his immaculate hat. Sheriff Hart let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Luke straightened, one painful vertebra at a time. "I didn't die," he said, voice raw, "but I sure came close." The crowd leaned in. Luke nodded toward the far ridge. An old Navajo sheepherder found me downstream, half drowned. He dragged me out before the water finished the job, took me to his hogan, kept me alive with herbs and stubbornness. When I could walk, I walked, mile by mile. He drew a slow breath, but I heard things before I left that canyon. Things your hired boys said. At that, Judge Kincaid stiffened. His eyes flicked toward his gun hands. One of them shifted in the saddle. Luke continued. They argued over who'd get paid more for fixin' the headgate problem one way or another. I reckon a bullet in the dark was their idea of a solution. A murmur rippled through the crowd like wind stirring dry leaves. Sheriff Hart stepped forward, shoulders squared in a way he hadn't dared before. "That lines up with something I got last night." He pulled a folded telegram from his coat, from the territorial marshal. "Looks like Kincaid's bank dealings caught someone's attention. Quiet investigations already begun." Gasps whispered through the crowd. Ben Crowder muttered, "Well, I'll be damned." Judge Kincaid's hand twitched at his side, like he wished he could snatch the telegram out of the air and burn it before the truth took root. "This is slander," Kincaid hissed. "Rumors from a half-dead drifter and a sheriff who's forgotten his place." Luke leaned, just slightly, on the saddle. "I was half dead, Judge." But I heard clear Wade, who had been shrinking behind his father's shadow for weeks, suddenly snapped. Fear made him reckless. Panic made him stupid. "You think you can come back here and ruin us?" Wade shouted, lurching forward. "You think this town's worth dying for?" His hand darted to his gun. Maggie gasped. Several women pulled their children close. Hank Calloway reached for Luke, but Luke didn't move. He didn't even flinch. Wade took one stumbling step closer, eyes wild. "This is your fault," he screamed. "All of it. None of this would have happened if you'd just walked away like any sane man." He lifted his revolver, pointing it at Luke. Before anyone could shout, Judge Kincaid moved, not out of love, not out of bravery, but out of blind, grasping panic, the instinct of a man who saw the last thing tethering him to power slipping through his fingers. He lunged forward. "Wade, no." The gun went off. The bullet grazed the judge's own leg, ripping his trousers, dropping him to one knee with a strangled cry. For a heartbeat, the world froze. And then Sheriff Hart fired, not a kill shot, not vengeance. A clean, practiced shot that hit Wade's gun square, knocking it from his hand and sending it clattering across the dirt. Wade stared at his empty fingers like they were betraying him. Before he could reach again, Hart was on him, twisting his arms, snapping the irons around his wrists. "You're under arrest," Hart said, voice steady, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Assault, attempted murder, and about half a dozen other charges we'll sort out later." Wade struggled, face twisted. "Pa, do something." Judge Kincaid, clutching his grazed leg, looked up first at Wade, then at the town gathered behind Maggie's fence, and finally at Maggie herself. What he saw there broke something in him. Not hatred, not triumph, but people standing truly standing because they wanted to, not because they were paid or afraid. Ben Crowder stood tall, despite the soot on his shirt. Hank Calloway leaned hard on his stick, but didn't falter. Reverend Marsh's Bible was tucked beneath his arm like a shield. Women who had spent their lives being quiet now stood shoulder to shoulder, with children at their skirts, and Maggie Cole apron still damp. Hair wind-tangled, eyes shining with something fierce and gentle, all at once stood at the center of them. Judge Kincaid's breath left him in a ragged sigh. He saw it fully for the first time. He had men with guns. She had people with hearts. He had money. She had loyalty. He had fear. She had hope, power, real power. Was choosing to stand on the side of a fence even when it cost everything. And he had none of it. His voice cracked. This town was mine. No, Reverend Marsh said softly. You only held the mortgage. Kincaid's shoulders sagged, suit dusty, hands shaking as he pressed them to the ground for balance. The judge of Coyote. Bend, the man who'd bent laws, lives, and land to his will, was now kneeling in the dirt of a woman he thought he could crush. A long, heavy silence settled. Luke, still wounded and swaying, met Maggie's gaze across the fence line. There was pain there, and exhaustion, and a quiet, unspoken gratitude. Maggie stepped forward, not toward the judge, not toward Wade, toward Luke. But before she reached him, her steps slowed, breath catching. Because behind Luke, behind the wounded man who had returned from the water and changed the course of her life, something else was coming. Something no one had expected. A rider, dust trailing behind, riding hard, carrying a badge glinting in the sun, the territorial marshal. And with him a reckoning. Weeks passed, and Coyote Bend settled into a new rhythm, slow, cautious, like a town waking from a long fever. Dust still drifted down Main Street, wind still rattled loose shutters, and the sun still rose over the same wide mesa. But something deep beneath all that had shifted. Judge Eben Kincaid and his son Wade were escorted out of town in shackles, flanked by 2 deputies from Santa Fe, and the territorial marshal riding tall in the saddle. Townsfolk gathered in silence as the small procession clattered down the road. No cheers, no jeers, just quiet, quiet, and a sense of breath long held finally exhaled. Wade's face was swollen with anger and fear. His father's was pale and hollow. The judge didn't look at Maggie. He didn't look at the town. He looked only forward, as though the road ahead was the first thing in his life he could not control. When the riders disappeared beyond the ridge, Maggie turned to Sheriff Hart. You think they'll get a fair trial? Hart adjusted his badge, one he'd nearly lost, and nodded softly. Fair as men can make it, and more than they ever gave this town. The bank was taken over days later by a territorial trustee, a thin, meticulous man who wore spectacles and carried ledgers like they were sacred scripture. He recalculated every debt carefully, tracing each figure with a fingertip. Some notes were reduced, a few forgiven entirely. He returned Maggie's deed with a simple nod. This land is yours, he said. Properly yours. She thanked him. Though words felt too small for the moment, the Copper Star Saloon, the place where everything had cracked open, stood shuttered for a time. Its doors were nailed, windows covered, whiskey gone stale in the barrels inside. Then one morning, Maggie awoke to the sound of hammers. By dusk, half the town had shown up with tools and lumber. Ben Crowder hauled new beams. Hank Calloway leaned on his stick and pointed out which boards were still good. Reverend Marsh helped scrub the floors. Spirits cling, he said, but they don't swim. Weeks later, the building reopened as a boarding house and cafe. No upstairs rooms, no dark corners for men to hide in. Someone brought a piano from a forgotten ranch house, tuned it until it sang again. Children peered in through the windows. Men drank coffee instead of whiskey. Women laughed without fear of being overheard. For the first time in years, the Copper Star smelled not of sweat and bitterness, but of cinnamon, hot bread, and morning light. The creek became the town's second healing under a new agreement, written plain, signed by ranchers, townfolk. And the mill, the water was shared equally. 3 men and 2 women formed the water committee, making sure each ditch got its fair fill. No rifles, no head gates guarded by hired guns, only buckets, shovels, and honest work. Children splashed in the shallows again. Horses drank deep. Cottonwoods along the bank greened brighter than anyone remembered. For Maggie, the sound of running water remained something more than relief. It was the sound of a battle won by people who had once been too afraid to speak. Luke Carver healed slower. The bullet had cut a deep line across his ribs. The river had taken half his strength, and walking back from that canyon had carved a remaining piece of him that he had never shared with anyone. But he healed. Some mornings, he helped Ben in the blacksmith shop, hammering iron cautiously, his breath still hitching on the heavier swings. In the evenings, he wandered to Maggie's yard, never announcing, never knocking, just appearing like the dusk itself. He fixed her line posts first, then the roof shingles, then the small gate that had never hung straight, then the porch rail. The jobs grew smaller as he healed half because he was running out of broken things to mend, and half because he wasn't ready to stop showing up. Neither was she. One quiet evening, long after the heat had slipped off the land, they sat on her porch. Crickets droned. A lantern flickered between them. From the old Copper Star, now the Morning Star Cafe, a piano played a soft waltz. Slow, gentle. The kind of tune people used to dance to before the world hardened their bones. Luke leaned back, careful of the bandages he still wore under his shirt. "Town's quieter," he said. "Feels different," Maggie replied. "Feels safe." Maggie's smile was small but real. Didn't think we'd see that again. Wind rustled the cottonwood above them. After a long pause, Luke exhaled slowly. "Reckon I'll be moving on once I'm mended proper." The words landed heavy, like a dropped bucket that echoes too long. Maggie looked down at her hands. "I figured you'd say that. Never stayed anywhere long," Luke murmured. "World burns easier when you put down roots." She didn't answer right away. She watched the lantern glow across the porch, watched the second chair beside her empty, worn smooth by years of weather. A chair that hadn't been used until Luke sat there his first night back from the creek. A chair she'd kept there without thinking, or maybe thinking too much. Finally, she spoke. "If you go," she said softly, "I'll keep that chair anyway." Luke's brows drew together. "Why's that? Seems a waste," Maggie whispered, "to have a place waiting for someone who doesn't mean to come back." He froze, a long breath, then another. The wind shifted, carrying the faint notes of the piano, the scent of coffee drifting from the cafe, the murmur of a town learning to breathe again. He turned toward her. "Maggie," he said quietly, "I've spent years riding past trouble, past people, past places I might have called home." His voice cracked, honest and unguarded. "But reckon it's time I stopped being that man." Their eyes met in the lantern glow, 2 souls with scars, 2 hearts that knew loss too well, finding something gentle in the ruin. "I ain't riding past this," Luke said. "Not past you." Maggie looked at the second chair, then at him. Her breath shivered once, then steadied. Good, she whispered. Months later, morning light spilled across Coyote Bend. The former copper star, now bright with coffee steam and laughter, opened its doors to the day. Farmers filtered in, children chased each other along the boardwalk. A piano played a hymn soft enough to drift with the wind. Down the road. Maggie's yard shimmered in the early sun. Shirts flapped on the line Luke had rebuilt. Water glittered in the ditch. A small garden sprouted green in the corner. And on the porch, 2 chairs waited side by side. Luke Carver sat in one, boots crossed at the rail, coffee steaming in his hand. He nodded to neighbors as they passed, receiving nods back, real ones, not the fearful kind. Maggie stepped out with a second cup, placed it beside him, and sat. The wind carried a soft tune from town, and for the first time in a long time, the music of Coyote Bend, the real music, finally stopped hurting. Sometimes, healing begins where we least expect it, in the quiet choices no one sees, or in the single moment someone decides not to look away. Maggie and Luke's story isn't really about gunfire, or land deeds, or a town standing up to a powerful man. It's about the small, stubborn courage it takes to stay human, in a place that keeps telling you to be afraid. About how a single act of kindness, a hand reaching back into the dark, can change the course of a life. Maybe even a whole town. And maybe the softest truth in all of this is that healing isn't loud. It happens in the slow rebuilding of a burned washhouse, in neighbors choosing to stand shoulder to shoulder, in the way someone pulls a chair closer, quietly hoping you'll sit in it someday. If you've ever felt alone or overlooked or tired of carrying your own storms, I hope this story reminds you of one thing: we don't heal by being rescued. We heal by being seen and by letting someone stay long enough to see us through. Thank you for being here with us, for giving your time, your heart, and your quiet attention to a story that carries a little dust, a little pain, and a little hope from the old frontier. Every like, every share, every subscribe isn't just a button you press. It's a way of keeping these human stories alive, a way of telling the world that kindness, courage, and second chances still matter. We're grateful you're part of this trail with us, and we hope you'll ride along for the next story.